Hi everyone, welcome back. So let's continue our S6 philosophy discussion of historicity. So remember in the previous recording, I was trying to introduce this text written by the Belgian philosopher Albert Dondijn. Okay, his basic thesis is that the human being is a historical being, and he tries to what he does in the text is to try to explain this, and as you will see, he will first of all refer to our pre-philosophical experiences, our ordinary experiences as human beings, in order to show that it's true that we are historical beings. Remember what that means. Being a historical being means that history doesn't merely happen to you. You're not a, a passive experiencer of history. Okay, you don't simply passively witness historical events. Things do not simply happen to you. You are more active, you are more creative as a historical being. While you experience history, you can at the same time create history yourself. So if we go back to remember those scenarios that I presented to you before, the Nazis losing to the Allies in World War II, the the fate of one of the main figures, one of the main characters in Game of Thrones, at least in the early parts, and this hypothetical scenario where you end up homeless and alone. If you ask the question, were these things meant to be? Dundane's answer is no. You know, the answer is no. What he means to say is it might sound commonplace. It might sound um, like a cliche that it goes without saying. We all know this, but what Dundane would say, inspired by contemporary philosophers, that there were decisions taken that led to these historical outcomes, and you know this scenario in uh, the fictional world of Game of Thrones, and um, a situation where you might be penniless, shelterless, and totally on your own. Human beings made certain decisions, and what followed upon these decisions were, particular consequences. So nothing is fated. The thing is, part of Dundane's argument is that we've always been historical beings, but it's only these days in our contemporary age that we are more aware of this fact. Okay, but if you look back at history, I mean real history, human history, and at the same time at the history of thought, of the history of ideas, you will see that people weren't always aware of their status as historical beings, as creators of history. If you go all the way back to ancient times, for instance, the Greeks had this idea of fate, that things were meant to be. Moira, the idea of fate, that even the gods, even the Olympian gods, couldn't do anything if something was fated to happen. Okay? For instance, if you remember the story of Oedipus, it was prophesied that um, the child of Laius and Jocasta would kill the father Laius and sleep with the mother Jocasta. And Laius and Jocasta, they tried their best to keep this prophecy from happening. So what they did was to try to get rid of their child, uh, which was of course Oedipus, but then things happened in such a way that Oedipus would survive, become the prince of another country. When he was a young man, he would encounter Laius and Jocasta, there would be a disagreement between Oedipus, the young man, and King Laius. Oedipus kills Laius. Eventually, Oedipus, gets to marry Jocasta, the queen, and, you know, as you might say, the rest is history. The prophecy happened regardless of the efforts of these people to, prevent it from happening. So that's the idea of fate, that things are meant to be, that even powerful beings like the Olympian gods could do nothing about that. Once it is proclaimed as fated, it is proclaimed as destined to happen. But, you know, Dundain tells us in his text Historicity that this is a retrospective fallacy. The idea of fate, it's only because we're able to look back at past events that we could say, oh yeah, that this was meant to happen. It makes sense this way. But it's only because we have the advantage of hindsight. We're able to look back and in a way impose our own logic, our own reasoning upon events and make connections. But are those connections really there? No, probably not. And part of this, part of this faulty idea of fate is, this tendency to believe that what has happened in the past will happen in the future. What has happened in the past that if you look back, that looks like, you know, something that was meant to be. And then because that seems so solid because it already happened, there's no way to change it. Some people have the tendency to transfer that solidity, that factualness of an event to things that will happen in the future. But this connection or this transfer of the character of the past to the future is in itself a decision that we make, okay, for whatever reason. Maybe because we want some consolation, maybe because we are afraid of the future, maybe because we want to be able to tell ourselves, okay, that, you know, okay, we're here in the present, we're about to embark on a particular project, we're about to do something, let's say it fails, and then we can tell ourselves, well, it was meant to fail anyway, you know. So in this way, we are free to shift the blame from ourselves to other things, to things that are external to us. And this is part of the idea of faith, because we seek the consolation of understanding ourselves as not responsible for our actions. Okay? That there are things out there, forces in the world, forces in the universe that, conspire to bring about this outcome. We're not responsible. It wasn't us. It was something else. You can say that, for instance, moving on in the history of thought, in the Middle Ages, Christian believers, they had this idea of providence, that God will provide, that God has a plan. And usually Christians tended to believe that this plan was for the good, for the better. So what was the consequence of this way of thinking? That people were content to be where they were at. They were content to accept their stations in life. If you were a peasant, if you were born a peasant, you'd stay a peasant your entire life. There was very little social mobility. You had to accept your position because God willed it. God willed it to be so. So you know, this leads to a sense of resignation, a sense of being resigned, being reconciled with your position in life, because at the back of your head, you're thinking, an intelligent, benevolent, caring, supreme being willed it to be so. So I might as well accept it. And this applies to many other things. If, there's this king that rules over a particular group of people, it is the will of God. If the plague happened and your family members are victims of the plague, you can find consolation in the idea that God willed it to be so, that this is part of God's plan. There's nothing else to do about it. Okay? Even in modern times, you still have this idea of, of things being meant to be. You have, for instance, Leibniz, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, German philosopher, wrote the Monadology, the Discourse on Metaphysics, and many other writings. He developed this idea of the human being as a monad, as a kind of atom, but an individual monad. He calls the monad this substance windowless and doorless. Only God can affect it. There is, according to Leibniz, no real interaction between monads. Why is that? Because monads are governed by a kind of pre-established harmony founded by God at the moment of creation. And one monad is simply unfolding what it already has inside, whatever God put inside that monad. And so your life is a matter of unfolding. It would be an illusion to, the idea that monads are actually interacting in real time. That's a kind of illusion. What's happening is that one monad, one substance, one person is simply unfolding what he or she already contains in himself or herself, and the other monad is doing the same. But there's no real interaction. Everything has been pre-established. So the idea that, you know, whatever happens to you is meant to happen to you. So you have this idea even in a modern philosopher who wrote in the 17th century, a philosopher like Leibniz. Now, Dunedin points out that, historicity means we are makers of history, and that today we're no longer solely focused on the past. We know, for instance, that we as human beings are always forward looking. We're looking towards the future. And because we're looking towards the future, we have a responsibility because we are makers of history. History doesn't only happen to us, we also make history. So that imposes upon us a kind of responsibility because it's in our hands. And he comes back to this idea again and again that human work is a foundation of history. Why is that? Because work means that we are able to human work means that we are able to transform the world into something that is more human, that the world that accommodates our projects, that's suited for our human projects, our desires, our needs, our dreams and ambitions. Okay, we are builders of culture. That's why I like this painting. You can find this in the Rijksmuseum. There's this daughter of a potter. Her lover is going to go away, but before he goes, she traces his shadow. It's as though something happens and yet she reacts. She creates something in response to what is about to happen to her. And in this way she creates something that is meaningful, something that lasts, something that can be repeated. And isn't that what culture is? We are builders of culture. As builders of culture, we are capable of building a world that makes sense, a world full of meaning. Okay, you can see that around you. This is, to quote Jean-Paul Sartre, a human world, a world that we created in our own image. Okay, so I'll stop there, and in the next recordings, we're going to talk about pre-philosophical experiences of history.